Hi guys, it's vf.miniatures Warhammer Tactics series, and in this video I'll give you my top 5 codexes for 40k beginners, the reasons for playing each one of them, and we'll also discuss the features that make a codex beginner friendly. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So first things first, an army should be easily collectible. It means that it should not be vast in size like Sisters of Battle or Orcs or sometimes Tyranids if you want to play Hordes. Because whenever you want to go for at least a battle-ready standard paint job, it will take you more time to build and paint 30 models than, for example, 10 Space Marines. Next point, the army should be relatively easy to build and paint. Nowadays, when most of the models are not metal or fine cast like in the good old days, the building is not a problem. The painting, on the other hand, is a different animal. So what we're looking for is an army that has some simple paint schemes that you can find on YouTube and follow, replicate, even when you don't have a lot of experience or any experience for that matter in painting. Next point, the army should offer multiple playstyles, but preferably those that aren't too hard on the brain. There are some armies in this game like Grey Knights, 1000 Suns that will melt the brain of even the most experienced players sometimes, because they are active in all the phases and you need to coordinate all your movements and your actions that you're going to be doing right from the start of your turn until your next turn, and sometimes you even need to think 2 or 3 turns ahead, and that's very hard, especially for beginners. So ideally the army should be active in 2 or 3 phases, and the 4th, like psychic phase, should have a support function. And the criteria that comes right out of the third one, the army should give a player a taste of what all or most phases of the game feel like. Because we need to consider the educational element of your first army, because you are starting out 40k and you need to know how the game operates, and preferably in all the phases. However, it's not a must-have criteria, because there are some armies, and we'll have a look at them in this video, that are great for beginners but are not active per se in some of the phases. But you will learn those phases through the hands of your opponents. And the last but not least, the army should be strong enough not to discourage the person from playing it. And I must explain this one in detail. I believe truly that any army in 40k in faction can be built and mastered to a level where you can win a tournament if you have enough of experience. So if you deeply like an army and you want to collect it, and someone talks to you and says that, oh no, you should not collect this army because it's very bad and you'll be losing all the games, don't listen to them. Collect what is fun for you, because any army, again, can be built to a very high competitive standard nowadays. But some armies are easier to do that, and these are the armies that we are looking for, because in some cases the codex is so well written, sometimes brought just very powerful and OP, that you can build practically any list and it will be good enough for winning the games. And first army on our list, the Death Guard. They are incredibly fun to play both for and against. I've encountered them countless times in tournaments and it was always a fun game. This army is active in all the phases, however the psychic phase has a more of a support function, so it won't be taking as much of your brain power from the other ones. Death Guard have incredibly strong rules, and this is the army that if you build a good enough list for a tournament, you can definitely rely on them in a fight. They are incredibly hard to shift because of their disgustingly resilient rule that applies to most of the models in the codex, -1 from the damage characteristic of weapons that attack them. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that -1 damage is one of the most important defensive rules that we have access to in 40k right now, because the amount of multi-damage weapons has increased and the damage to weapons are very numerous nowadays in codexes all over the 40k, and having that ability to halve the damage from the damage to weapons is incredible. If that wasn't enough, they also reduce the toughness of enemy units, no matter what that unit is, a vehicle, monster, titanic unit, doesn't matter. They reduce the toughness of those units by 1 within a certain distance that increases as the game goes on. And it works both in melee and shooting. So basically, the closer you get to Death Guard, closer you get to your death. They have some very strong shooting options and some incredibly powerful melee units, like their Death Shroud Terminators or their Blight Lord Terminators or Plague Drones. Almost anything in this codex is great in the fight, apart from, say, Plague Burst Crawlers. So it's a very big and diverse codex, and if you really try and squeeze all the options out of it, you won't be bored for a long time. Many of these options are competitive, if that's something that you're looking for. This codex has a ton of stratagems, and they are great. Some of them make enemy units run away. Others make your units even more deadly in combat. So no matter what you're looking for, you'll probably find it in the stratagem sections of the book. Contagions, which are the things that you pay points for and you can upgrade your units and characters with them, are another layer of customizability that you can apply to your army. And the Death Guard characters are some of the toughest bastards in all of the 40k. With some relics and traits, you can build them to be nigh unkillable. Another great thing about the Death Guard is that this army is relatively easy to collect. There are a lot of easy to build models you can find on eBay and other marketplaces that are incredibly cheap. Plus, it's a fairly elite army, so you'll only be probably needing like 30 or 40 model stops. Unless you're going to build a 150 Poxwalker Terminus S list, and in this case, all power to you. Lastly, they should look battered, rusty and filthy. It means that there are several relatively simple paint schemes that even a novice can try out and successfully replicate. But if at the end all your models look like feces, no one can say that it's not correct from the lore point of view, because it's actually correct. Next are the Adeptus Custodes, one of my favorite armies in 40k, the golden protectors of the Emperor himself. They are a great army to collect and play, especially for beginners. They are extremely easy to paint up to a basic battle-ready standard because most of their armor is metallic gold. And if you know something about painting, you know that metallics are great for beginners because they are very forgiving. It's easy to apply them to the miniature. Because of that metallic sheen, even if you don't highlight your armor, don't spend the time for that, which I recommend because it's pretty easy still, and you just apply a wash all over your model, it will still look okay for the purposes of the battle ready standard, because the metallic shine won't be completely obscured by the wash, and the wash will give you those shades in the recesses that you need to have contrast. Because they are a hyper elite force, the 2k army of Custodes will probably consist of around 20 models, especially if you go for more dreadnoughts and bikes. So it's pretty easy to collect them. They are probably the easiest army to collect in 40k apart from knights. They are extremely potent both in melee and in shooting. And even though they don't participate in the psychic phase, they have some ways to protect themselves from the onslaught of the psykers. They have a whole arsenal of abilities, stratagems and traits that make them a nightmare to attack. Like the Emperor's Auspice, which turns off all rerolls to hit, to wound or damage on the attacks that target a particular unit in your army. Or Arcane Genetic Alchemy, which is basically the equivalent of the Space Marine Transhuman that prevents them from being wounded on better than force. If you couple that with toughness 5, 2 up save, 4 up and 1 all around the army, and toughness 6 or 7 or even 8 on some of the models, access to Vexils, Praetors, which are the standard bearers of the Custodes that apply a buff to units within 6, either the dense cover or light cover, which makes them even more resilient. You get an army which is incredibly hard to deal with. They'll teach you how to conserve your resources and hold on just a little bit longer than your opponent in order to win. Each model in your army is so important that if you really try and do all you can to save each and every one of your Custodes, they will repay you tenfold. Because 3 models on the table may sound like a death sentence for some armies, but for Adeptus Custodes it's just another day of work. Necrons, murderous zombie robots of the 41st millennium. That's the quickest way to describe what this army is. They have the same great trait as the Adeptus Custodes, which is they are mostly a metallic army. So almost any paint scheme for them that you'll find on the internet will be beginner friendly. They are definitely pretty easy to collect because there are loads of cheap, easy to build leftover models from the Indomitus box sets and some other box sets on eBay and other marketplaces. They can be used very effectively in all of the phases of the game apart from the psychic phase, and they'll teach you all the basics plus some advanced techniques to score win more, like the reanimation moving. Reanimation protocols is basically an army-wide rule that allows you to revive your models when they get killed right after the attack sequence ends for the particular enemy unit. And if your squad is not completely destroyed, you can roll the number of dice that is equal to the wounds characteristics of all the models that were destroyed. And if you get enough of 5 pluses, your models start reviving. It's much easier to achieve for models with 1 wound like Necron warriors or flayed ones, but it's still possible for some 3 wound models like Scorpion destroyers if you roll enough 5 pluses. Enough means equal to or more than the wounds characteristic of the model that you want to reanimate. And a great caveat here is that when you reanimate a model, you must place it in coherency with other models in the squad, but not particularly in the place where this model was before. So you basically can kill the model from one part of your squad, one place, and then teleport it to the other part of the squad. And if it's a 20-man Necron warrior unit, these chains of models can be pretty long. And even though this mechanic is pretty gamey and I think it should go in the next version of the Necrons Codex, nowadays you can definitely use it to your advantage in order to grab objectives when your opponent wasn't prepared for that. You can even block some charges and heroic interventions off if you get enough models killed, funnily enough. And ultimately you can decide whether to build a reanimating and shooting Necron warrior sea of metal or drown your opponent in tides of mindless Scorpion destroyers, because this codex has a lot of ways you can build it, whether with Novak and melee heavy units or Mephrit with a lot of gauze shooting warriors. And Necrons are a fairly elite army. Even their basic troops, their warriors, they cost 13 points per model, which is not that cheap. It means that most likely you will not need swathe of models to fill out your 2000 point army. There is an option of building an army like that. There are several options, but you can build an army out of just 30 or 35 models tops. So yeah, Necrons are very survivable. They can catch opponents off guard with their reanimation protocols. They're relatively good in shooting and melee, and they're very fun to play with and easy to collect. So a great beginner's codex. And if you want to learn more about competitive play with Necrons, I have a video about that on this channel. Now the Tau Empire. They are pretty easy to paint for beginners because they have a lot of straight edges that you can easily highlight just by tilting your brush. Not that much color variation if you don't want it. So basically you just need to be careful and patient and you have a pretty Tau army. They are a very strong codex nowadays, just like the Adeptus Custodes, and they excel in the shooting phase. Probably no one in this game is so powerful in a single phase as the Tau are in the shooting phase. They'll teach you all about the target priorities, which units in your opponent's army you need to destroy first, which ones you need to soften up and leave until your next turn, and so on. The range game where you'll be measuring the distance that your opponent can move and then shoot in order to outmaneuver and outrange them. How to bait out the buffs and debuffs out of your opponent in order to target what you actually need to destroy. And if you want to be really proficient with Tau, you'll be extremely aware of the movement phase, and that's another thing that the Tau will teach you, because you won't be able to correct your mistakes in the charge and fight phases like most other armies can. In most cases, you will have some options to charge with some units, but generally it's a bad idea for Tau with their 5-up weapon skill. So whenever you stop moving in the movement phase, that's where you're stuck until your next turn, and that's something that you need to consider. They have a vast amount of viable builds that you can use in this book. It's one of the best codexes that the Games Workshop have released in the 9th edition. A bunch of awesome stratagems, great warlord traits, awesome advanced prototype systems that you can apply to your units and commanders and make them even more deadly in the shooting phase. Probably the only drawback that I must mention about Tau is that if you start playing 40k with Tau, you will get used to being inactive in the charge and fight phases mostly, and overly active in the shooting phase, and that's something that you will need to adjust when you change up your army eventually. Tau Empire was actually my first faction in the 40k, and I remember when I switched to the next one, it was a very difficult jump. But I get used to it eventually, and I'm sure you will too. Actually, it's a very great time to start collecting and playing Tau Empire, because this new codex is much more interesting than the codex that was in the 8th edition. And if you want to learn more about collecting Tau Empire as a beginner, I have a separate video on this channel just about that. And the last entry in this top 5 are the Knights, both the Chaos Knights and the Imperial Knight. These towering huge war machines are another great way to start out in Warhammer 40k. They are one of the easiest armies to start collecting in 40k because you only need like 5 or 6 models to have a 2k army, provided those models are much bigger than the usual size. But with help of rattle cans, dry brushing and washes, you can definitely paint up some knights pretty quickly. And if you learn a couple of weathering techniques and apply some decals for decoration, they'll look pretty good. Knights are very fast, deadly in both fight and shooting phases. They move 12 inches if we're talking about big knights, and the armages or war dogs as they're called in the Chaos book move 14. For comparison, a Space Marine has a move characteristic of 6 inches, so just half of a knight's move. Big knights are great in the fight because they have 12 attacks with their stompy feet at strength 8, AP 2 and damage D3, or if they have a sword or a fist, they are even deadlier against vehicle and monster targets. And the same goes for the shooting phase as well. One of the things I love about knights is that they teach you how to fight on the move. Because when your opponent has dozens of models on the table, when you have 5 or 6, you are forced to coordinate your firepower and your charges very efficiently. And that's why knights are great for beginners. They teach you how to play 40k in its purest of forms. And depending on how well you're going to be piloting them, they can be extremely fragile and very durable. One thing is for sure, if you're playing knights, it will probably be very fun for you and your opponent both. Plus, with the recent updates from the balanced data slate, the knights received the abilities to control objectives much better. For example, the armigers and war dogs are now OPSEC and count as 5 models, and the big knights, they don't have OPSEC, but they count as 10 models on the objectives, which means that it will be much easier for you to outscore your opponent than it was previously. Previously, knights were losing on objectives all the time. So if playing 10-meter high robots of death is something that you would want to do, knights are an army for you. So that's it, guys. I hope this video was useful for you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.